pleased to have all of you with us this afternoon for what we know will be an inspiring conversation led by Joe Cimperman. Joe served on City Council for 18 years. The neighborhoods he served were downtown Ohio City, Tremont, and a part of Clark Fulton. He assumed his current role at Global Cleveland in 2016, and it's almost as if it was a role written specifically for him. He grew up speaking Slovenian on the east side of Cleveland and has been a true son of the city and servant for our communities ever since he left his parents' home. He attended John Carroll University, and he has instilled the spirit of service in his children as well, because you will often see them accompany him on his various civic journeys and commitments. He is a passionate protector of diverse and vulnerable populations. This was evidenced in his service on City Council and is more clearly evidenced even now in his work with Global Cleveland. He's a man who thinks as quickly as he speaks. He is action-oriented. He is a proud alum of Leadership Cleveland 2003, and I know you have a cheering section here from that group, Joe. And you also have a cheering section here as you went on the inaugural Adler mission to Israel in 2017. So with that, let's welcome Joe Cimperman.
Hi, good morning, Marianne. Thank you so much. And thank you, Rob, for this invitation. I really appreciate it. And thanks to Leadership Cleveland for just being that constant anchor for civic engagement in Cleveland. I really appreciate that. And I want to just say a quick thing to everyone who's on this call. You know, there was a woman who used to come to the State of the City every year. I don't know if you guys remember, her name was Renee Lipson. And Renee would ask the one question to the State of the City whenever the mayor, whoever she or he was, would be, I'm this person who's retired, I don't live in the city anymore, what can I do to help the people of our community? And I always thought that one of the best answers maybe that any mayor could have had for Renee would have been really engaged with the people at Leadership Cleveland, who I think continue to show through their network and through their life's passion how you can serve the city of Cleveland in a lot of different ways. So thank you to the institution of LC. I was asked to come on. Obviously, there's a lot of conversations going on these past 3.5 years around immigration and newcomers. Just a quick 30-second intro. Global Cleveland was an organization that was formed. We're in our 10th year now. Our founding institutions were the Jewish Federation of Cleveland, the Cleveland Foundation, the City of Cleveland, Cuyahoga County, the State of Ohio, and a few philanthropic and private partners who wanted to do something that was pretty clear and straightforward, which was to welcome, integrate, attract, and retain international newcomers into our community for the shared prosperity of everybody. There's a reason for that. Cleveland 100 years ago this decade was at a point where almost half of our population spoke a language other than English first. So in the decade between 1910 and 1920, our population, which at that time was the 6th largest in the Union, was at a point where almost half of us were not able to easily communicate with one another. And a lot of times when you explain that to somebody without the context of Cleveland, you think of a story in the Old Testament about Babel, or you think about places where clearly there's just a disconnect or some kind of chaos. And yet I remind people that institutions like the Cleveland Foundation, the Cleveland Metro Parks, and the City Club, I think 3 exemplary Cleveland iconic institutions, were all created and formed in that same decade, when one would have thought that our ability to really engage civically in something that we're still living with today in a great and positive way started at a time when we weren't able to necessarily easily communicate with each other, but we're bringing these ideas from all over the world in terms of what sociologists and demographers call thought mixing. I say that because if you heard a scream on Thursday at about 10:01, coming from the offices of East 2nd and Euclid, it was when the Supreme Court decided in a 5-4 decision that the program known as DACA, Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, was allowed to stand. We are an organization that is non-political. Our board is proud to have people from all major political parties. And I will share with you that one of our incredible partners to date has been our mayor, has been our county executive, but has also been our governor, Governor Michael DeWine, and his Lieutenant Governor, John Husted. We're an organization that recognizes that the only way forward is if we do this together. So as a true nonprofit, we're nonpartisan, and it's really important because the decision that was authored in terms of DACA by the Supreme Court was a bipartisan decision if you look at how the judges lined up in terms of when they were appointed. People ask me, why is it so important? It's really about the promise of America. It's also something I think that we have to talk about in terms of the economics. We know that right now in Northeast Ohio, the most recent data actually comes from March of 2020. In the state of Ohio, there are approximately 8,000 DACA recipients in the state of Ohio. In Northeast Ohio, those numbers break out to about 800. So there are 800 dreamers right now who are living and working in Northeast Ohio. And the important part of what I just said is that part of a person who is part of the Deferred Action Program has to be employed, has to be contributing, and so many of these dreamers are. These studies are critical because about 25% of those 800 dreamers in Northeast Ohio, like 25% of the 8,000 in the state of Ohio, like the number that goes to the nation, 25% are currently engaged in the healthcare industry. These are frontline nurses. These are folks that are working in the lab. These are people that are perhaps assisting physicians, if not physicians themselves, in terms of the work that we're doing. And at a time when we need all hands on deck, considering the international pandemic we're going through, the fact that the Supreme Court decided to allow many of these people, a full quarter of them, continue the work they're doing, we think is really important. It speaks to the reason why this program was instituted in the first place, which is something that we talk about at Global Cleveland, which I think is safe to share as I'm working my way through this presentation, which is that we often say that the United States economy is 60 years ahead of our educational system and 50 years ahead of our immigration system. And what I mean by that is that our economy is moving forward at such a pace and requires the kind of talent and the input and the workforce that our current population isn't capable of supplying that for either our economy, our workforce, whether we're looking at the agricultural workers who are working on farms or the folks that are working inside of our technological spaces. We have to be a place that understands immigration. And why DACA existed in the first place is something that I think every person of every party agrees to, which is that what has to happen is a fix to our broken, Byzantine, absolutely dysfunctional immigration system. I can share with you stories from our own agency at Global Cleveland as we've gone through the H-1B process that's in the media right now. The president is talking about curtailing that, and already you're hearing hospitals and chambers of commerce across the United States say, please don't stop the talent pipeline, which H-1B is. I can share with you stories about people who have fought for our nation, who are from Northeast Ohio, who are in the wars in Afghanistan or Iraq, and who have been deported because of our immigration system. Or I can share with you the story of a really painful meeting we had right before the pandemic, which was a young man who was from Belize, who was polylingual. He spoke 4 different languages fluently, who had a job at a firm that's well known because somebody on this call right now works there. He was beloved by this firm. He was an engineer. And because of the way that he came in and the transition of his visa, he had to leave upon graduation from his graduate program and was being wooed by the nation of Canada because they already had 2 job offers for him. Those job offers, if one of them were accepted, would mean instant citizenship in Canada within about 6 months. And this young man, who wanted nothing more than to spend his days here in Northeast Ohio, giving back as he had already done, who I think all of us would be thrilled to have as part of our Leadership Cleveland class or as a colleague on staff. I actually got a phone call from him last week. He's thriving in Toronto. And he's somebody who I think is just one personal example of why this immigration system needs to be repaired. But there's hope. Since 2011, Northeast Ohio has seen an increase of 3,000 people born outside of the United States. Immigrants, refugees, secondary migrants, international students, people who have decided to make Northeast Ohio their home permanently. Every year, year after year since 2011, that number has gone up by 3,000, for a net gain of almost 30,000 people as we enter 2020. That's really important because as you hear the stories of Cleveland's declining population, which are not a good story, that number would be far worse if we weren't attracting those people who are coming to work at places like our hospitals, coming to work at places like our medical institutions and our leading nonprofits here in Northeast Ohio. And that's an important number for us to remember. Another important number for us to remember, there's an organization called the New American Economy. And it was an organization that was started by the Bloomberg Foundation when Mayor Bloomberg was the mayor of New York, who felt very passionately about our broken immigration system and how we actually had to fix it. What he did was really interesting was he seeded this organization to start supporting cities like Cleveland, Milwaukee, Detroit, Atlanta, Chicago, you name it, at small cities, large cities, in terms of what we could do to make our own communities much more welcoming. 3 years ago, Cleveland was ranked in the bottom quartile of all the top 100 cities in the United States. So we were somewhere from 75 to 100. The year after that, they actually gave us a number, which is 2 years ago. They gave us the number of 64. Cleveland was ranked 64th. What were some of the criteria? How easy was it for a newcomer to find a home? How easy was it for them to find a job? What did our language access look like? How was our Federal Reserve locally treating people in terms of their economic disparities if they were international? How many of our major police forces recruited in languages outside of English? So when you look at what these criteria were, they really were a great yardstick of where cities were. And Cleveland ranked 64th 2 years ago. In that same year, Columbus ranked 67th, Cincinnati ranked 18th, and Pittsburgh ranked 32nd. Not that I'm competitive. Not that I looked at numbers of cities that I feel competitive toward, and now 2 years later, still remember them as much as I do to brush my teeth and have a cup of coffee in the morning. But we worked at it, and what we learned from the study was two things. One was that Cleveland doesn't tell its own story well enough. The truth is there are so many people, so many institutions, many of whom are on this call, that are working double time to make sure that newcomers are welcome, and yet there was no one place where all of that information was being shared. The second thing we learned was that with a few tweaks and a few policy changes, we really could be that city that people want to come to if they knew about it, if we communicated it better. So we spent the better part of 6 months connecting with 45 different organizations, some of whom are on this call, in terms of the statistics of how they serve immigrants. As an example, we were working with our partners at the Cleveland Food Bank. In my opinion, the best food bank in the United States of America. Does a better job for the people who are in food insecurity than anybody else. Well, we were asking Kristen questions like, how many international people do you serve? How many foreign nationals come to the food bank? And the food bank's like, Joe, we serve everybody, right? We don't look at criteria based on that. But when we started to work with Kristen, she was able to provide some strands of data that actually showed that Cleveland is 15% better than any other city in terms of how it serves its international community, through language access, through providing information in different languages, by working with smaller nonprofits who are engaged with those international communities. And so we were able to put that data forth. And we did that time and again. Last year, the city of Cleveland was ranked. And while we were ranked 64 2 years ago, the city of Cleveland moved up to the number 14 last year, because what we were able to show was that a lot of people in Cleveland are working, even if we don't always talk to each other, and certainly if we don't always share that with the world. We're going to be ranked again this year. It's now an ongoing thing, and it's something that we feel is really important because everybody on this call knows the importance of metrics, and it's something that allows us to really move forward and show what ways we're working. Finally, I want to make sure we have enough time for questions. One of the things that we're all looking at right now is how resilient are the organizations in which we serve, the organizations in which we lead. When Governor DeWine, who I will just say to you, I'm not supposed to be political, but I think has just been doing a fabulous job for newcomers. I will share with you, he was one of the first governors in the union to write a letter to President Trump and Secretary Pompeo saying that refugees are welcome in Ohio. This was back in November when the State Department was saying that states had to allow people to come in or not. Our governor decided to get his staff together and wrote a letter he didn't even tell us he wrote. We got a copy of it from the State Department because he was that out there in terms of making sure that what we were doing was welcoming newcomers. We knew that when the governor started his COVID presentations, language access is tricky. And we were thrilled that the governor had a person who spoke American Sign Language, But we started hearing from our Spanish-speaking partners, our Swahili-speaking partners, and our Arabic-speaking partners that some of the language wasn't coming through Google Translate. So we worked with the Ohio Department of Development, we worked with County Executive Budish, and we worked with the mayor, and we said, are you okay if we start taking what you're communicating and we start translating it with our volunteer translation bank? We started with 3 languages and 5 volunteers. Today we are up to 60 translators in 29 different languages. And if the governor were to come on TV today and basically say something, our translators would get the edited version of what the governor said and would go out to all their listservs. At one point in the height of the COVID pandemic, we were sharing information that was being reshared with almost 50,000 people in Northeast Ohio. And the reason why that's so important is this. Yes, English is the language we all speak, right? Yes, this is a language that most people who are newcomers here know how to speak. But when you need to translate things like the Economic Recovery Act or the importance of COVID and the public health information, or the fact that we want people to feel welcome in Northeast Ohio, regardless of what our federal government is saying in DC, sometimes when you say it in someone's mother tongue, the effect is that much more powerful. So we're thrilled that we're able to provide that. We're a team of 6 people, and we try to do what we can to be responsive to our citizens here in Northeast Ohio. One of the things that I'm really proud of is last year for Welcoming Week, we reached out to the 58 mayors and managers in Northeast Ohio, and now half of them, about 30 of them, are engaged with us in terms of their own ideas of how to welcome people in terms of their cities. And we're working with superstars like Mayor Wheelo, Mayor George in Lakewood, Mayor Wheelo in South Euclid, Mayor Blackwell in Maple Heights. And we're going to continue working with our partners across the region because we think that the role of making immigrants' lives easier is actually something that benefits all of us. Mr. Kirshner.
Joe, thank you so much. And I really do want to highlight that seismic shift from 2018 of ranked number 64 to 2019 14. That really is remarkable, and your leadership helped move that needle tremendously, and a lot of the partners that you mentioned. So congratulations and thank you. We do have a lot of questions, so we're going to get right into it. As you look at the ways that you're working with and supporting our immigrant and refugee families and everything going on with the pandemic, in what ways have you had to respond that were different than the ways that you were interacting with the families before? And I think my little asterisk in that question is we know the tremendous resiliency of these families and possibly have things to learn from them in that regard.
Well, thank you. Yeah, we always say, Robert, that to immigrate is an entrepreneurial act. For people to come to the United States requires a fortitude and a courage that I think is novel, movie, right, worth retelling, story worthy. Mm-hmm. And so people were ready. In the newcomer community, people were reminding me, especially some of our newcomers who were coming from different nations that had gone through SARS or had gone through the avian flu. There are individuals who are here, or even Ebola. People were saying, well, we were in our home country when this was happening, so there was almost a readiness to adopt whatever was needed to make sure that not only they stayed safe and their family members, but almost a sense that there was a willingness to wear masks and to be a little bit more careful because it's a non-medical way to treat a medical issue. Language was a big issue. We were seeing in our Congolese community a real disconnect. People ask me all the time, what are the number one newcomer communities coming? It depends on if you're talking about folks coming to the clinic. It depends on if folks are coming through Refugee Response or Us Together or Catholic Charities or USCRI. It depends on secondary migrants, right? There's all these different populations that we work with of newcomers. But a lot of folks in the Congolese community were saying we need to have this information in our mother language because a lot of the people who are coming here are recent arrivals or are going through English as a learning language program. So we jumped on that really quickly in French, in Swahili, in Kigali, and different languages that were being spoken in Congo. The biggest thing that I thought was really interesting was how the newcomer community came together with the production of masks. There's organizations out there like butterpair.org, that basically produce medical quality masks by employing women who came here through the refugee program. And it's a phenomenal mask program, Butter Pear. They work out of West 65th in Detroit. It really ignited a lot of the entrepreneurial spirit from a lot of the folks inside of the newcomer community. We also saw people getting hired, Robert, by Heinen's and by Dave's, because if they had been laid off from another job, our grocery store chains, which had already been really open and working with our newcomer community, were hiring them. So it was a really interesting point where parts of the community were really flourishing. I will share with you something broke my heart, and I hope I'm not violating any confidences. I won't give specifics, but I will share two cultures. We've been asked by the state a couple weeks ago to translate quarantine and isolate orders into Nepalese and into Spanish. Those were communities that were seeing an outbreak. What that tells me is that they weren't getting enough of the information fast enough. And now we have hotspots within those communities. And so we're trying to do what we can. And when I say the Spanish-speaking community, it could be anyone who has migrated here from Puerto Rico to people who've immigrated from Costa Rica, Guatemala, Mexico, or El Salvador. The Nepalese community is a little bit easier because it's a little bit more concentrated. But we're going to do whatever we can with our governor and our county exec and our mayor to make sure we get the data to people. What's been really interesting is the number of immigrant restaurants who've applied for funding from the county and the city. And I'm really proud of that, because I don't know that those statistics were there before the CARES Act came out. And we're going to keep doing what we can to make people feel that they're part of this economy, because they certainly are.
Great, thanks. There's a couple questions about the Supreme Court ruling, and then also one about the H-1B visas. And you've mentioned a couple times you're nonpartisan, but there are certainly advocacy issues that are important. And to kind of summarize those questions, are there things that we can do either in a reactive or a proactive way to support or advocate for some of the legislation that will help advance your work?
100% yes. So I'll just share with you. In the last 12 months, I've been to the White House 3 times to advocate with the National Jewish Federation on an issue that I didn't think was partisan, but it was really interesting how partisan it became. That issue is something called the public charge. The public charge says that so my mom, who immigrated to the United States in a way that would be considered legal. So she came here with a visa, she came here with paper before she and my dad got married. And she was someone who went through all the things that you have to go through. The public charge, as mandated by our current federal government, said that before my mom was a citizen, but she was here legally, had she applied for food stamps, public health care, or public housing in her test to become a U.S. citizen, the federal government could use that against her because she had been a drain on our society. And as a result of that, would be subject to immediate deportation. That policy has not been the law of the United States since 1889. And so I was with as many Republicans as I was with Democrats in the White House saying, you don't want to do this. This is not this is not something in a state like Ohio that would have the expected outcome that you think it would have, right? We're thinking about the ripples in the agriculture community when you talk about food stamps. We're thinking about the effect of important providers like Metro Hospital or federally qualified healthcare associations when it comes to Medicare, Medicaid. We're talking about places like CMHA with public housing and the Section 8 program that are already under such duress, and we failed. The federal government decided to push it. We were part of a group of people that sued to change it, and the courts upheld that it was the federal government's right to do it, and we still think it's really bad policy. On the DREAMER Act, on the DACA Act, we are putting together a group now that's going to really be working hard with our senators, with Senator Portman and Brown. We could basically answer the president's call for a fix by fixing it. Our legislature has the ability to do that if they have the will to do that. I would encourage people to communicate with your congresspeople and your legislatures to let people know that. We will continue to work with people like Governor DeWine and Mayor Jackson and County Executive Budish, who have all of them adopted a pro-immigrant stance. It's just sometimes really hard when you get to the federal level because there's so many other things that are happening because of the different bodies that individuals are in. But we are asking people on DACA to call our senators and our congresspeople to make sure that people know how important this is, because these are people who are as much a part of our American fabric as anybody else, and it's so important to be an advocate for that.
Great. Thanks, Joe. You mentioned at some point in your talk just the hope and what that looks like, both from the newcomers coming in and the environment that you're helping create here in Northeast Ohio, and also your hope kind of looking out at some of the wins and the advances that you've made. So, final question here as we're coming close to time is, what gives you hope as you look forward in the next couple of years with your work and us becoming the community we need to be as we get back to a better normal?
So I'm going to bring it home with this group, because this group did something that I think is pretty amazing. A couple of years ago, I had the privilege to tour Thomas Jefferson International Newcomer Academy, the largest English as a learning language public pre-K through 12 school in the United States. The brainchild of Eric Gordon when he was the chief academic officer. And if I don't say thank you, God, for Eric Gordon once a day, it's not a good day. Thank you, God, for Eric Gordon. So he took all these programs and put them in one school and created this international community of newcomers. Leadership Cleveland has made it part of their regular diet. Leadership Cleveland has given of its time and treasure. I can tell you volunteers that are there. Thank you, Mary Ann. Thank you, Robert, for making this an important part of a Leadership Cleveland person's year. But there was a young man who came through after one of the Leadership Cleveland classes by the name of Carson Baldwin, who is biracial. His dad's African-American, his mom is white. He is a brilliant student at university school. And he decided he wanted to start a mentorship program. And he went to Thomas Jefferson and he worked with a young man named Israel Kamabumbo from Congo. And the two of them said, we're going to do a peer-to-peer program called One Respect. It's a Haitian word for one love. And they decided that they were going to start getting to know each other as friends. Then they cut each other's hair. Then Carson taught Israel English, and Israel taught Carson French. Then their families started visiting each other. West 80th and Lorraine comes to Gates Mills Boulevard. Gates Mills Boulevard comes to West 80th and Lorraine. And out of that friendship, a brotherhood blossomed. And that brotherhood was the Accelerate winner last year because of Leadership Cleveland. Why? Because these two young people said, we are going to do something about our connections or lack thereof. And Carson today has over 100 students paired up with schools all across Northeast Ohio. And I guarantee you that Mani Ahuja and that the next Bill Gates, she is part of this group, this cadre of students, and the people who are going to power this city and this region and this nation forward are coming out of a program that Leadership Cleveland lifted up. And I think that's what gives me hope, Robert, is that out of the connections of Leadership Cleveland, out of the work of these two young people, something bigger than any of us could imagine is happening. And I think I can say this as someone who's going to be 50 years old next month. I just need to get the hell out of the way.
Well, thanks, Joe. They are absolutely inspiring. That entire school is an inspiration, as are you and your leadership. So I appreciate you sharing with us. I'll turn it back to Mary Ann Crossley, who can give her closing remarks and let us know what's coming up for the rest of the week.
Thanks, Bob. And Joe, I'm going to have you unmute yourself because I'm not going to let you get away. I don't think I've ever heard you speak to a group without giving us an action item. And often that's the opportunity to attend a naturalization ceremony. So how can we do that?
Well, funny you should say that. We are about to engage in a friendly brief that could lead to something maybe a little bit less friendly. Our government has shut down all naturalization ceremonies and is refusing to allow them to go video conference. So what we're going to do is in July hold a Zoom press conference to communicate to our legislators how important it is to allow people to become U.S. citizens. And so our action item is going to be, Mary Ann, I'm going to send this to you to get as many people to encourage our federal government to do something that we can do. If Huntington Bank allows me to deposit a check with this device, I think the federal government can take the oath on a Zoom call to let people become US citizens who've been here a lot longer than I've been alive.
Great. Will you share that with us and we will push it out? Thank you, Joe, for all that you do.